Welcome to Ferment Radio. I am your host Aga Pokrywka and my guest today is Maya Hay. Maya is a scholar and PhD candidate at Concordia University. Her doctoral research on fermentation and feminist theory focuses on embodied knowledge, collective ethics, and interspecies thriving. Her work experience spans chemistry labs, culinary kitchens, organic farms, and food markets, where she has gathered over 15 years of experience facilitating discussions around contemporary food issues. How would Maya describe herself in her own words?
I describe myself as a food maker and a researcher. Although, to be quite honest, I feel like so much of that question is, it's such a complex question that I find myself like adapting to whoever is asking me, because how I present myself at the university and like a research circle is very different than how I would talk with, like chefs and, if I was a fermentation consultant. And so maybe the best way to describe me is that I really enjoy making food, I really enjoy studying food, and I really enjoy making food with other beings, whether that is other people or other microbes.
Do you remember when this realization happened? When did you start to actively use fermentation in your work?
I came from a nutrition background, and when I was studying nutrition, I found it a bit problematic. Because it was very prescriptive, like the idea of eat this, not that, and eat this many grams, do as I tell you, and I had a really big problem with that because I thought, well, who am I to tell you what to eat or what to do? Like, I don't know anything about you. And at the same time, I didn't enjoy being told what to do and what to eat, especially because I saw so many discrepancies between what I was taught in school as being healthy and then the different lived experiences and food cultures that I grew up with. And so I was really interested in, well, what can we learn together and what food truths can emerge from different cultures, right? And truths being plural, that there's not one answer to doing things, but many ways of doing the same thing. And so when I started to kind of rack my brain around, what crosses cultures, what is something that's not just a fad right now, but has historically been in place, and, what's a bit more like back and forth and a bit more conversational than this prescription, all roads kind of led me to the idea of fermentation, because it is working with not just food ingredients, but working with an environment, working with microbial life. It is certainly an international, it spans different food cultures across the world, but it also spans history, right? And also spans species, one could even argue that, there are different, not just humans who ferment, right? So yeah, that's kind of how I got to that. And ever since then, I've just been going really deep down that rabbit hole.
Since we are talking about fermentation and that directly involves microbes, and I think there is a lot of superstition or kind of ideas in the society about microbes, that they are basically bad. What is your opinion? Are microbes good or bad or neither of those?
Yeah, I think the very idea of categorizing, that's the bad part, right? That to categorically say these things are good and these things are bad, that's our problem, right? Not the species itself. And that's not to say that certain species are capable of inducing harm, sure. But there are many things that can induce harm, and often it has to do with the right context, right? And it also has to do with perhaps even quantity. Anything can kill you. Water can kill you. If in, too much of a dose, caffeine can kill you at too much of a dose, right? So I feel that when we start to kind of make these generalizations, that is really the problem, rather than are microbes good or bad or otherwise, right? And so I tend to kind of not really subscribe to the idea of, well, these ones are helpful and these ones are harmful, or these ones are probiotic and these ones are pathogenic, because I think one of my favorite examples is there's a lactobacillus species that when it is in yogurt, it is considered probiotic. And then if you change the context and you put it in beer, it's considered an off flavor. And so the entire beer is just like tossed out. And then that same species, if it's in our urinary tract, it causes a urinary tract infection, and a full immune system response is mounted, right? So same species, 3 different contexts and 3 different labels. So this is a kind of example where, for me, it's not the species that's good or bad, it's how we categorize them. And any sort of binary of good, bad, or helpful, harmful, binaries are never innocent. It's not a spectrum. It's always a vertical relation, right? Good will always be better than bad. And so it's kind of binaries to me like that are never really helpful in terms of promoting a diverse or, inclusive environment. And I think part of the goal and the hope for fermentation is that one can create, a diverse and inclusive environment.
Since we started this topic about the binaries and like prejudice related to microbes, I wanted to maybe shift to how fermentation is perceived in a society. Especially recently, it became very popular or very hip. There is lots being said, like about superfoods which are fermented, and whole, green capitalism is earning money on it.
Of course.
Well, now I started to shift by myself to the dark side of fermentation, but maybe I wanted to talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, what do you mean by dark side of fermentation?
It's a little bit of using fermentation for becoming stronger, healthier, maybe prettier. So kind of using microbes for our own benefit. I don't want to say that this is necessarily bad, but I think that it kind of leads to this like a feeling of a superiority. Oh, we can control here some environment, so we can benefit out of it.
The way that fermentation seems to be taken up right now is in this sort of it's either in like a health way, like using fermentation to better one's health, or sometimes it's used in like a sustainability way, using microbes to minimize waste or to, recycle waste. And then there's also the kind of like desire and pleasure, right? Using fermentation to kind of find experiences that one hasn't found before, right? And in each of these situations, it's kind of, I agree with you that it's very narrowly focused on kind of human benefit. It's not necessarily, it's still thinking about humans as the end user, and that to me is a bit problematic, because if we only think about human health, then what does that say about the 1 kilogram of microbes that live in our intestine, let alone all the others that live on our skin and our nostrils and all sorts of places and crevices on our body, right? And if we're only using fermentation to kind of minimize waste and like compost all the things in the environment and to quote save the environment, well, like whose environment are we actually saving? It's pretty much I'm not sure that that's really an effective way of being mindful about others on this planet. And certainly for like the taste capacity, I find it very fascinating that restaurants and R&D labs are searching for all of these delicious potentials that come out of food, like using the end of a celery butt to make vinegar, or fermenting fish scraps in order to make a garam or umami based sauce. Like those are fascinating, especially when we start to look at like insects and whatnot. But at the same time, it's like, well, is that what does that do beyond the person who is dining at that restaurant? You know, I feel like the scope is just so limited. Like, we're not really thinking about a system scale anymore, right? We're not really thinking about the bigger picture anymore when we only think about using fermentation and using fermentation for personal gain, right? And I think part of that is also because fermentation used to be the only way of life, right? That unless you fermented things rotted. This was, before the fridge, this was one way to preserve foods for when there wasn't enough food over like winter or colder months, or, when there was famine. And when it was also usually a community thing too, right? So when you remove the necessity of it, and when you remove the communal aspect of it, I feel that there's something a bit empty in just saying, well, I'm using fermentation so that I can maintain, the optimal gut health. I'm not saying that one should not, especially in the current climate, right? Where medical systems are failing left and right. And certainly I think that if one can compost, sure. But I think that there's so much more that could be done on that system scale if we think about necessity once more, if we think about communities once more, if we think about, who is this ultimately benefiting? And if it is only me, maybe I could do better in how to approach the idea of fermenting. Who else can I involve? And who else can I, bubble up with, right?
I guess this is a question also about the relationships.
Absolutely.
Because probably humans do not perceive usually the microbes as collaborators.
Sure.
But more something which should work for our benefit.
Absolutely. And I think that, even the idea of collaborators is, I think, like, we don't really have a way of describing that relationship, right? To me, like, collaborators is something that's very conscious and very, the expectations are clear on both sides. Going in, we're both wanting the same thing. But the fact of the matter is, we have no idea what microbes want. We have no idea. We can presume that they want to live, right? But that's about it. And so, we have no way of really thinking about this kind of other invisible parts of ourselves. And in such quantities and in such diverse populations, right, that we can't even keep them straight. Like, that is, I think, if we can start to think about who we are, and we as in each individual is not just one single being, right? And if we start to approach the individual as a more holistic system, like the human body as an ecology, that I think has tremendous potential for health. And if we start to think about, the human individual as an ecosystem in a larger ecosystem in terms of the environment, then I think that can radically shift some of the sustainability talk, right? I think there's a great potential if we start to look beyond the individual self, right? When we start to look at those relationships and really nourish them. One of the things that I would love to happen, and I really wish you could see my hands right now because I am like shaking my fists at the sky. What I wish for the world is the X-ray vision, but microbe vision. If we could just see and identify and just understand how many different types of microbes are always around us at all times, I think that would really change things. And I think a lot of this is because they are invisible, because they were discovered in the European context, in the context of disease and decay and war. Like, it already has such a bad rap. But wouldn't it be great if we could have a different kind of relationship with the microbes who have already and always been with us, right? All this time, we have evolved together for so long. Wouldn't it be great to finally see them? That is my wish for the world.
Oh, I totally understand you because I'm fantasizing about the same. But you've mentioned also about the discovery of microbes in European setting or context. And I know that you have an experience of working also in Asia. And I was just wondering what in your experience could be a difference between how microbes are being perceived in the West or East. I'm sorry for this generalization, but I'm just asking for your experience.
Sure. I mean, I can really, I think, speak to what I learned from my field work. I don't know if I can speak on behalf of all of Japan or all of Asia, but I think one of the main differences that I found in talking with folks there is that there's at least a history of a different relationship, a perceived relationship between man and nature, that between Japanese folklore and geography and climate and like a collectivism that's made it really easy to understand humans as being embedded inside nature, right? That humans are part of nature, never separate from it. And that's evident in the architecture, for instance, of the old houses, right? How these large sliding doors would open to let nature pass through. And in contrast, what I find in the quote West is that man and nature are very separate, and that part of what maybe defines, or like the belief, the ideology that man has evolved to overcome nature, right? That they've built these boundaries and technologies to kind of overcome and keep those boundaries intact, so that man is immune from nature. I think is perhaps one of the main differences, because microbes are considered as part of that nature, right? And so, when I was working at a sake brewery, there's one of the main ingredients of sake is called koji, and koji is a rice malt, and in order to make koji, you need a mold called Aspergillus oryzae, and that mold originally came from the rice fields, right? They was growing already onto the rice fields. And so there was already this kind of understanding that, oh, let us continue to work with what we have. And what we have are these natural resources around us, as opposed to this sort of harsh line of, no, we are separate and we need to keep ourselves separate from the natural world, right? And those are very simplistic terms for sure. But I think, that perceived relationship of already being part of nature is, I think, a main difference. And then, just a different history, right? That Louis Pasteur, as I mentioned, discovered microbes in the context of disease and decay. And it was also during like some pretty difficult wartime animosity between kind of European countries. I don't know if you've ever heard the story of the beer of national revenge. Have you heard this story?
No, I haven't.
So please, you'll have to fact check me, please, because I can't remember the exact names. But there was a particular war between France and Germany, and it was over the kind of Alsace region. And Alsace is one of the main hop growing regions in France. And so when France lost in that war, they also lost part of Alsace to Germany. And with it, they lost the hops, the capacity to procure hops nationally, right? And so, well, what does hops do? Hops is considered a preservative. And so without it, a lot of the French beer started to spoil. And so Louis Pasteur, in like this totally nationalistic, super prideful moment, set off on this whole research journey because he wanted to make, quote, the beer of national revenge, to get back at like reviving the beer economy of France without Alsace and without Alsatian hops. So, to me, that sort of history of contention and constantly trying to overcome an enemy, right, is really what fueled the Western idea of learning how to command microbes at will, as opposed to learning what they do and what they can do and how they are a part of us and part of our bodies and part of our worlds, right? That it always kind of became framed in this like commercial or political conquest, right? So yeah, that the historical differences are, I think, noteworthy too. And of course, in the modern age, of course, both of the things that I've just mentioned are, a bit fuzzy, right? That especially with globalization, that there's, certainly a more Western understanding of how good or best practices or what protocols ought to be. Whatever differences may have been worth noting, I think are starting to, if not already, dissolve.
What would be your advice or idea how we could communicate with microbes the way how we are right now, how we can live alongside with them?
I think sight is kind of the go-to, seeing is believing. I also wish that we could just sense them in other ways, right? Not just be able to see them, but if we could smell them, for instance, before we realize it's too late, right? I feel like often smell is the last indicator of microbial presence, right? When things have just gone too far, and it's often very off-putting, the stench, right, that comes through. Or funk. I mean, there are many people who adore that smell. But yeah, I think that when we start to think about fermentation as not being a formula, right, that fermentation isn't just take a food thing and add a microbe to it and voila, you have fermentation, right? But instead, if we were to then approach fermentation as being about creating environments that are conducive to change and inclusive environments that are conducive to ongoing change, I think there's like a wonderful opportunity there to then make spaces that are worth living in and not just for us humans, right? So that's like maybe the one way to think about living together is to create environments, and not just physical environments, but also social environments that are spaces that are worth living in and spaces that are conducive to this kind of ongoing invitation to as many and as different beings as possible. And then with that environment, I think that kind of thinking about that kind of shared environment also means that we have to really tune into what's in that environment, right? And that engages our entire bodies, it engages all of our senses. And so it's more than just nonverbal communication. We have to really be aware of ourselves in space. And dancers know this, and I think anybody who moves their body or is kinesthetically, practicing, knows this concept of proprioception, which is, the physical understanding of self in space, right? This is actually, proprioception is what like scuba divers and astronauts, they actually condition their brains and like they condition their bodies to no longer be proprioceptive in order that they don't get motion sickness from zero gravity. So, it goes to show that it's a really grounding thing to be proprioceptive. And, how often do we totally just get into our heads about something, right? And totally become disembodied, right? Just completely out of our bodies and into our heads. And I think what what's so great about at least the material practices of fermentation, right, is that it's very tactile. There are so many different senses happening, all the smells and the textures and the squishes and the sounds and the, you know, smells, and it really engages the full body, and often with other people too, right? And so I think that there's such an opportunity to embody not just you know, these ideas and these practices of, oh, I'm creating this environment for ourselves, but to actually practice them in a very practical way.
So I wonder, is it something you can train yourself in, or it's something which you are like predestined somehow?
I would like to believe that it is something that can be practiced. And, you know, that isn't to negate the possibility of others having this wonderful, you know, sense. Um, I was going to say sixth sense, but I think that some people already argue that there's already seven. So I don't know if we're at eighth sense or what number we're at. Yeah, right. And I think it is something that one can attune to. You know, it's kind of like that tuning fork idea of, wouldn't it be great if we can selectively kind of tune into a different, you know, frequency, right? There's so much we cannot see. Microbes are only one of them, right? Electromagnetic frequencies, for instance, right? We can't see them, but they clearly have an effect on the world around us, right? Radiation's another one, invisible, but clearly has an effect around us and clearly has effect on other species, right? And so I think that compared to something like magnetic frequencies and radiation, the kind of frequencies or the kind of vibrations or resonances or, you know, the hum of working with microbes is, I think, something that one can attune to and one can develop. And I mean, this is like one of the big questions I would love to ask Sandra Katz, is be like, Sandra Kraut, tell me, how do you know what microbes need or want, right? Because I think that speaks to a larger problem of, we humans always want to assume that the relationship is good, right? That we have these symbiotic relationships, and that's another term, symbiotic, I feel like it's become synonymous with good, but at least in the definition in biology is, symbiotic only means that of the two entities, at least one benefits, right? So in the umbrella term of symbiotic relationships, parasitism is one of them because the host benefits at least one, right? Commensalism is another. Commensalism is where one benefits but the other is unharmed. If you think of, like, you know, National Geographic moments of like the rhino or the zebra, and there's like a bird perched on their back and they're like eating the ticks off, you know, the mammal's back, right? Like, one benefits the bird, but the other is unharmed, right? The rhino or the zebra. And then in a mutualistic relationship, both benefit, right? And I think that we want to think that microbes are benefiting too, but how do we actually know that, right? Like, that's the thing that I always get kind of hung up on, because, well, yes, they're allowed to live at least temporarily in my gut, you know, or on my skin or in my kitchen or wherever. But how do I actually know that they are living their fullest life? I will never know. And so rather than assume that, what if we, you know, just tried to approach the relationship differently? And then I guess we're back at that relationships conversation, right? But I think the idea that we can continue to use other forms of life at will without consequence, just because we can't easily understand them, we just assume that all things are good, I think that'll only just lead us to our own demise. I mean, look at antibiotic resistance. That's exactly what happened, right? We always thought that, well, penicillin, it's going to save us, and it did. And we might not have thought about, well, you know, they get to live their best life by continuing to persist in a petri dish. But clearly there are other factors that really color the relationship, right? And so, all's to say, I think that it can be cultivated. I'd like to think that it can be cultivated. What do you think?
Well, for sure, if I ever have a chance to do one episode with Sandor Katz, I will ask him this question.